All right, next we're going to look at 2.3 and 2.4. We're going to finish up the birth of a nation. And what we see here, we're going to begin with Hamilton, Jefferson, and the emergency of political parties. And there we have them. Yeah. Washington's cabinet was, I'm trying to think of the best way to put this. Washington had a cabinet. A cabinet is a group of advisors, and he only has 4 members in his cabinet. Hamilton is going to be Secretary of the Treasury. Jefferson is Secretary of the State, and it deals with things like diplomacy, other countries, and Henry Knox is Secretary of War. John Jay is Attorney. John Jay is not Attorney General. John Jay is John Jay is the Attorney General. I'm going crazy. Okay, so Hamilton, as the Secretary of the Treasury, he has to basically set up our economic system. And his plan, he has a job. He's got a big job. We've got to rebuild build our economy. There's no rebuilding about it. We don't have one. I want you to consider that as a colony of Britain, we relied on their money, their currency. They were our major trading partner. Everything we did, we were dependent on them. And though we're a fairly wealthy place in terms of our natural resources, we have no manufacturing. We have no trade partners. We have none of that. And so we've got a lot of problems. And Alexander Hamilton, brilliant guy, not likable, but brilliant, has got to come up with a way to start from scratch and to solve these problems, okay? So he's got to pay off our debt, and he's got to create a stable currency. Good luck with that. First thing he's going to propose is that the federal government is going to need to assume state debt due to the war. What this means is to assume debt is the federal government needs to take over and pay the debt. It is a national debt. It is not a debt of South Carolina or Massachusetts or New York. This is a debt of the United States. It's a United States war, and we gained our independence from it. Thus, the United States needs to pay that. Most of the southern states, with the exception of South Carolina, had paid theirs off. Understand that. But a lot of your northern states were still struggling with that debt. And so for that reason, southern states are going to oppose this plan. They've already paid off their debt. Why would I pay off my debt and then take yours? They didn't want to help the other states pay off their debt. And so the compromise was, okay, we'll go along with this, but we want the capital moved south. Not moved further south, but moved to the south. Okay, so the new capital would be in Washington, D.C. Now, Washington, D.C. was created by land donated by Maryland. Even though this is pretty much directly in the middle, this is technically a southern capital. Okay. The next thing he wanted to do was create an excise tax on whiskey. Why a tax on whiskey? Well, you know, it's a tax, and governments never met a tax it didn't love. So it would raise revenue, it would strengthen the economy. And let's be honest, governments like to tax things that they see as immoral, basically creating a sin tax. Alexander Hamilton wanted to control the drinking habits of Americans. If it costs more, they won't do it, which not really true, but it does limit some. Jefferson and Madison are not really happy about this. A lot of Western farmers grew grain, but it was hard to transport that across the Appalachians, so they would turn that grain into whiskey. And so that made transport across the Appalachians easy, and it also made it cheap. Okay, so they're unhappy about this tax. They feel like it hurts farmers worse than anybody else. And so Jefferson and Madison, big fans of the farmer, big supporters of the farmer. They're not going to support this. Okay, this is going to pass, and it's also going to lead to the Whiskey Rebellion, and I'll mention that in a minute. His other plan was to create a tariff. Now, a tariff is a tax, but understand that a tariff is more than just a tax. It is a tax on imports, okay? And the whole purpose here is to strengthen and protect U.S. businesses. Tariffs are always protectionist. And by that, I mean they protect American-made goods. Okay, and so we needed to know. Again, it's like the excise tax on whiskey. The purpose here is to raise revenue and strengthen the economy. Here's your problem. Just like Madison and Jefferson supported the farmer, they don't support industry, which is what that tariff would protect. Jefferson believes that democracy depends on the independence of the farmer, and he wants to keep an agrarian, agricultural economy, okay? And really, he's not a fan of tariffs, industry, manufacturing, any of that, okay? And he felt like tariffs would lessen the competition and raise prices on finished goods, and they do, and they do. So again, this also would hurt the farmer who didn't necessarily have the money. The biggest issue is going to be the national bank. And this is going to create a lot of problems down the road, particularly when we get to Andrew Jackson. Okay, the purpose is Hamilton claims that the bank was necessary and proper to establish a national currency and regulate trade, both of which the Constitution said was the job of the national government. So, because we have to regulate trade and because we have to mint a national currency, we have to have a bank. Jefferson and Madison are going to contend, though, that the Constitution doesn't specifically say that the national government has the power to establish a bank. Thus, it's a power that belongs to the states. And we'll look more at state versus federal power in 2.4. Okay, so those are the issues. That's Hamilton's economic plan. I went ahead and put this here. I like the fact that it is in just one graphic in this little chart here. And you can look back, and this probably is an easier way to study this. But I really like this, even though I just said that in different ways. Okay, so let's go back to that that whiskey tax right there. You know, you're talking about it. It's this one right here. The hostility among the Western farmers. Now, understand Western farmers does not necessarily mean Ohio, Kentucky, places like this. I mean the western part of the eastern states. Okay, just want to point out that. Okay. Pennsylvania farmers are unhappy about that excise tax, and they're going to rebel, and they're going to threaten secession. Secession means to leave the Union. So it's not just those crazy South Carolina people who always threaten secession. The first threat of secession to our new Union was Pennsylvania, of all places. So it's interesting that, again, a tax is going to test the government. Okay? In response to this rebellion, President Washington is going to organize a military force that stops the violence. I'm going to go further than that, and I'm going to say President Washington didn't just organize a military force. President Washington led the army. President Washington got on his horse and led the army to Pennsylvania to put down this rebellion. Now, let's be honest, they saw President Washington come. He is a hero. He is the Revolutionary War hero. Everybody loved him. And they're just kind of like, okay, whatever you say, Mr. President. And they're just going to give up. But here's the thing. One, President Washington. We didn't have that. We didn't have an enforcer. That's exactly what the executive, the president, does. He enforces the Constitution. He enforces law. Okay? And he is going to organize a military force. Let's look at that. He organizes a military force. All things, something that they could not do under the Articles when we had Shays' Rebellion. And so that kind of brings up the comparison to Shays' Rebellion. And I do want you to be able to compare these two. Both of these were rebellions caused by taxes. Both rebellions are going to test the new governments. Shays' Rebellion tests the Articles and shows their weaknesses that can't be overcome. The Whiskey Rebellion, on the other hand, is going to show the strength of the federal government under the Constitution. So if we look at both of these as tests, if we look at these rebellions as tests, the federal government under the Articles failed with the Shays' Rebellion. But the federal government under the Constitution is going to win and pass with the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington was a great figure. He was a great president. Everything he did set precedent. He really is the one that organized our government. Now, our government organization with 3 branches, separation of powers, federalism, all that set up by the Constitution. But the way it was run was set up by Washington, and so many of his decisions stayed with us for many, many years. Okay? And there's just, I mean, he's the only president we've ever had who was elected unanimously. All of the states agreed to elect Washington. But again, it's Washington, you know. But he's going to serve 2 terms. And at the end of that second term, he's going to decide. I mean, people wanted him to serve for life. They didn't want a king, but they were not opposed to a president for life. But he sees the danger in that. And so he's going to set up a precedent of leaving office after 2 terms. Now, I will say that this is a precedent that we see followed until FDR. FDR becomes president during the Great Depression and serves as our president throughout World War II. So he actually is elected to 4 terms. He only really serves 3 full terms, and he passes away at the very beginning of his 4th. But he is the only president to have ever been elected for more than 2 terms. And after Roosevelt, we're actually going to put that as an amendment to the Constitution. But until then, every single president is going to follow Washington's precedent. So as he was leaving office, he gave a farewell address. He wrote a farewell address. And there's 3 key points about this that you need to understand, okay? The first point is that the United States should stay neutral and avoid permanent alliances with other nations. This makes sense. We are a brand new country. We don't have a permanent army. We don't have a real navy. We have no real way to defend ourselves. And we don't have the money to give to foreign nations, either by helping them fight or even giving them aid. We need to stay neutral. We need to avoid permanent alliances. Now, I'm going to tell you that, again, this precedent is going to stay with us for 100 years. We are going to stick with this idea of neutrality and isolationism for the next 100 years. Okay. He also states that good government is based on religion and morality. We need to do the right thing. All right. I'm not going to belabor that point, but it's a good point to look at. Plus, when people begin to say that our founding fathers weren't overly religious, not necessarily true. Finally, this third point, a little bit of an irony here, is the dangers of forming political parties. The reason why he's opposed to political parties is because he saw the formation of them within his own cabinet. And in some ways, he's probably semi-responsible for it. He chooses a lot of different people, not a lot, but those four different people, Hamilton and Jefferson that we looked at right here, with all of these things, with Hamilton's plan and how Jefferson opposed him. They were not yes men. And that's important. He picked men who knew their own mind, and he was able to listen to their arguments and then make decisions and go with it. But what he began to find, as this was happening, was that Jefferson and Hamilton were really evolving into political. It started as factions, and then it became our first political parties. And if you look at these two are very similar to the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, okay? The Federalists, very similar to what we had seen with the Constitution, but again, with the Democratic Republicans, many similarities to the Anti-Federalists. Very different, though. Very different, just in terms, one of them was a faction, and this is the actual political parties. Okay, look at these differences. You need to know this. You're going to have to recognize this. On the test, I'm actually going to have, or on the quiz rather, I'm going to have a matching section. It's just going to be 2 questions. I am going to list characteristics of the Federalists, and I'm going to list characteristics of the Democratic Republicans. And you're going to have to tell me which one belongs to each, okay? Federalists are led by Alexander Hamilton. They felt like the rich, educated people should lead the nation. Basically, an educated elite. Okay? They wanted a very strong federal government, and they wanted to encourage manufacturing and trade. As you can imagine, because of the manufacturing and trade, these tended to be people who were from the northern urban areas, although some southern elites were a part of this, okay? Also, a loose interpretation of the Constitution. This is that elastic clause. This is what Hamilton used to justify the Bank of the United States, okay? No, it doesn't say we can set up a bank, but because it says we need a currency and we need to regulate trade, gotta have a bank to do that. It's a pretty loose interpretation. We kind of stretch it to make it make it say what we want to say, okay? Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, led by Jefferson, also James Madison. They thought the people should have the most political power. Power should rest with the people. Now listen, the elite are the people too, but they meant the common man, okay? They wanted strong state governments. I do not want to say, don't look at this as they wanted to go back to the Articles. They didn't. Even Jefferson recognized that a stronger federal government was needed. However, he wanted the states to keep their power too. Okay. They wanted to encourage farming. They were very much fans of an agrarian economy, a farming economy. And again, don't look at this as strictly a North and a South issue, because you had a lot of farmers in the North who were Democratic Republicans too. Okay. And they're going to support strict interpretation of the Constitution. And again, same thing. Jefferson and Madison were like, the Constitution doesn't even mention the word bank. Thus, it's a power that belongs to the state. That didn't fly well in the end. So, okay, a lot of other things are going on too. Not domestically, with foreign policy. Now, foreign policy has a lot more to do with Secretary of State. So some of this is going on during Washington's administration and on into Adams' administration. Okay, so there's a little bit of movement here. We're going to start at the kind of the tail end of Washington's administration and moving into Adams. Okay, and Jefferson himself is the 3rd president, so you can kind of see the progression here. Okay, the French Revolution is breaking out, and we have a little bit of an issue going on here. Do we support, I dare I say, the French? They're both French on both sides of that issue. Who do we support? Do we support the revolution? Do we support the people of France against the nobility? Do we support the nobility, the government, the king, or do we just not get involved? Well, the Federalists, like Washington, favored neutrality. Okay, um, and let's be honest, the Federalists, if we go back, look at this one right here. They thought that the rich, educated people should lead. Well, that was who the French Revolution was against. It was against the elite. And they fear the power in the hands of the mob. And that's kind of the way they saw the common man. And so the ideas of the French Revolution scared them. If it's successful, what might it mean for us? So they're not really a fan of the revolution itself. And another issue here too is the fact that Alexander Hamilton doesn't like the French. He likes the British, so they tended to favor the British over the French. The Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, favored the French Revolution. They favor the people. They favor the revolution itself, fighting against the status quo, the monarchy, the nobility, and again, let's look at the leader of the party, Thomas Jefferson, very big fan of France. He loved France. A lot of that probably had to do with the fact that he was very flattered that they had used his Declaration of Independence as a model for their Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. He thought that a revolution would actually produce a government close to America's political leanings. He could not be more wrong. But again, that might have been some of his pride speaking. Okay. Another issue, and this is not all foreign, but it deals with immigrants, was the Alien and Sedition Acts. During the administration of John Adams, Britain and France were at war with each other. We want to remain neutral. Again, we can't really afford to get involved. But we want to keep good relations with both sides. Now, and we have a bad tendency to do this. We do this with World War I to a degree, and at the beginning of World War II. Britain and France are fighting each other, but we want to continue to trade with both Britain and France. But if we trade with Britain, France sees that's bad, so they're going to attack us. If we trade with France, Britain sees that as bad and it's going to attack us. There's all kinds of bad things going on there. It's not possible. It's not possible. We want to remain neutral and not take both sides, but trade with both sides. Okay. All kinds of problems with impressment of soldiers. Don't necessarily need to know that. But it gets us into a lot of trouble. Okay, a lot of conflict. Okay. So as a result of the war between France and Britain, the Federalists are going to pass a series of acts. One is the Naturalization Act, and it's going to increase the requirement of residency in the U.S. for citizenship to 14 years, doubles it. And the other one is an Alien Act, and in this, the government could arrest, detain, and deport anyone they believe to be untrustworthy foreigners. Understand that this is a direct attack against the Democratic Republicans because immigrants tended to vote Democratic Republican. So we're going to increase the time before they can vote, be a citizen and vote. We're also going to detain any we see as troublemakers. And then with the Sedition Act, we're actually going to see the government limiting freedom of speech and expression. Now listen, our government does this throughout history, particularly in times of war. They're going to limit our civil liberties, and we will talk about this, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam. Anyway, it happens throughout, but the first time we see it is the Sedition Act there. And like I said, these laws were used typically to silence critics who happen to be, for the most part, Democratic Republicans. And like I said, it was because immigrants tended to be poor and tended to be drawn to the Democratic Republicans. Um, and so these laws kind of kept them from voting. By the way, you notice how a specific political party will favor immigrants for their vote. So see, even things going on today are nothing new. They've been going on literally since the birth of the United States. Okay. Democratic Republicans do not like these acts. They see them as an abuse of power. And in response, Madison and Jefferson are going to pen the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And these state that if a state believed that a federal law was unconstitutional, then it did not have to obey or enforce it. And this gives us the doctrine of nullification, and this is what South Carolina is going to use later when we get into things like, secession. All right, finally we have 2.4, and that's the principles of the Constitution. And separation of powers is one of those principles, so let's jump right into this. The Constitution is based on the ideals of limited government and rule of law. We have defined those words. We have talked about those words. We talked about them in Chapter 1, and I'm bringing them back up here. Okay, everybody has to obey the law. Nobody is above the law. Government is limited. We have rights. Okay, and so the founders are going to establish a republican government, and this is where we have members of an elite leadership class representing members of society overall. We can quibble, we can go back and forth on the elite aspect of it, but they do tend to be elite. At the time that our government was founded under the Constitution, it's a land-holding elite. You couldn't serve, you couldn't vote, you couldn't participate unless you were a property owner. And again, that's number 3. We're a democracy in a sense, a Democratic Republican in a sense, but again, it's only males who own property who could vote. Okay. So, is everyone truly represented? No, not really. But we're on our way. Okay. We'll see an expansion of this when we get into around 1820s. We begin to see the property qualification go away. And finally, let's look here at the end. We have separation of powers here. Okay. Under the separation of powers, you have 3 branches of government. Okay. 3 branches of government. You'll notice that each branch has specific duties. Okay. Legislative branch writes laws. Now, the president, the executive branch, can propose a law, but he can't pass a law. That is the legislative branch, okay? But he can veto. He can veto. And we go back to the legislative branch, and then they could override it, and then it becomes law. Now, the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, can interpret the Constitution and other laws. Okay. And you have your national powers down here at the bottom. You have your division of powers. We have a federalist system. Under a federalist system, you have a national government, and underneath that you have state governments. The national government is the law of the land, and the state governments have not really independence, but they have their own state governments, and they each have powers. They each have things that they can do, and so here, if the federal government has a power, it is directly given to them in the Constitution, and the state powers are reserved. If it's not mentioned as a power for The federal government, it is reserved for the states. So these are things that they can do. Schools aren't mentioned, so they can set up schools. They can make regulations for marriage licenses. You'll notice that driver's licenses weren't mentioned in the Constitution. It could be because there were no cars. Thus, state IDs, driver's license belong to as a state power. But there are some things that they can both do. Okay? You've got, we mentioned earlier with taxes, you have the national, you have the federal sales tax, you have the state sales tax, you even have local taxes. Courts, interstate commerce, banks, regulating banks, not creating banks, borrowing money, punishing criminals. So all of these things are things that they share. Look, make sure you know what these three branches do. The legislative branch writes law, the executive branch enforces the law, and the judicial branch interprets the law. Now listen, funny thing about interpreting the law is that wasn't something that initially was written into the Constitution. The reason we have that is because, oddly enough, the judicial branch created it with their interpretation of a court case, Marbury versus Madison. Okay, make sure you know Marbury versus Madison. It sets up the power of judicial review, in which the courts can decide if an act of Congress, a law, or the states is unconstitutional. And if it is, it goes away. You either have to change it or it just goes away. All right. I'm going to give you a couple of other court cases that are going to expand the power of the federal government, and that's really under the leadership of John Marshall. Okay, the Chief Justice John Marshall. So in class, I'll give you a list of those court cases that you need to know. But just understand that the Supreme Court during this time, all of their decisions are going to expand the power of the federal government. Okay? All right. Please make a note of any questions you have. I went through that last part super quick. I didn't go over every single one of those principles. I hope I don't have to. But if you need me to, please, by all means, come see me and raise your hand, ask a question in class. Study for your test. Be ready.